Hello and welcome to week 13 of this course of Introduction to Korean History. And this week we focus on the Korean War, less than 3 years period of duration, but a devastating conflict both for Korea and the entire region. Some people have said that the Korean War had nothing to do with Korea. It was just the place where the war was fought. That may be an overstatement of the case, but the scholars who say that do have a point. Because the Korean War, the Korean conflict, had just as much to do with the Cold War and what was going on in the gathering battle lines being drawn between, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, but actually what would be called the free world or the democratically oriented nations versus the socialist and communist oriented nations. And of course, there was a huge other block of undecided nations that never joined one side or the other. But battle lines were definitely being drawn. And so in a way, the Korean conflict became a test case of what would happen if the United States and Russia were to go to war against one another. And in fact, in a way, that's what happened, because you had conflicts, battles and engagements during the Korean War, where it was actually U.S. troops fighting Russian troops and vice versa in Korea. So that was happening in the midst of the conflict. But that whole conflict was much more complicated. Douglas MacArthur was still in command of the Pacific Theater. Still, the United States was kind of in the same configuration it had been in militarily since the end of World War II. MacArthur was a brilliant man, but he had some blind spots. And some scholars have said MacArthur never let reality get in the way of his ambitions. And that may be a way of understanding MacArthur. And he definitely did not comprehend the reality of North Korea and China. China had just become a communist country officially 1 year earlier. So MacArthur was completely blindsided by the ruthlessness and efficiency of both North Korea and China in building up their military. And in those days before satellites were a thing, it was hard to know what was going on in an enemy nation if you didn't have eyes on the ground. And that's basically what happened. While the United States was sort of working through its Korean allies to sort of rid the southern portion of Korea of communist influence, meanwhile, North Korea and China had been building very efficient military forces. And so even though China had just gotten organized 1 year before, already by 1950, 1951, China is prepared for a direct military confrontation with the United States. It's quite unbelievable, whether you like China or not, that they could have gone from the Civil War sort of configuration they'd been in during World War II and beyond up to 1949, and then actually organize their military to the point of confronting the United States within a year. The Pacific Command also, under MacArthur, did not realize how unprepared South Korea was militarily when the invasion actually took place on June 25th, 1950. The Korean military was simply crushed under the weight of the North Korean military, with much more modern equipment, tanks, and Russian forces directing and sort of in the rear of the North Korean war effort. So they were not on their own in any way, shape, or form. The city of Seoul fell in 3 days, 3 days after the invasion. So the United States went almost immediately to the UN a couple of days, actually the day before Seoul fell, to seek condemnation of the invasion, and they did that successfully. They built up a coalition of 15 member nations that would intervene militarily along with the United States. There were other nations that were willing to provide supplies and resources and equipment, but they didn't want to go militarily into fight in Korea. And so officially, it was a UN force that went in to support the South Koreans, but in fact, the majority of the people were from the United States, and it was being directed by the U.S. military. The efforts, the UN efforts, were being directed by the U.S. military. While the United States was busy negotiating in the United Nations, North Korea continued its lightning advance into South Korea, and they were finally only stopped at an area of 150 square miles around the city of Busan. That was all that was left that was in South Korean control. Everything else had been taken over by North Korea. And I've heard testimonies of people who were children at the time of the Korean War as refugees who left Seoul going south, and of course walking, because there was no other way to go anywhere. And before they got halfway to Busan, they were overtaken by the North Koreans. The North Korean advance was so fast, the refugees couldn't outpace it. And so many people had to spend periods of time under North Korean occupation in different portions of South Korea. While MacArthur often made horrible miscalculations several times in the Korean conflict, he was at times a brilliant general. And that was very clear in his design of the amphibious landing at Incheon on September 15th, 1950. Some have called it a sheer stroke of genius. Rather than try to push up from the south, to simply come in from the side and then try to link the two portions of your forces together. And that's incredibly difficult to coordinate, but that is what MacArthur did, and he did it very well. A very large force landed at Incheon, and a few days later was combined with a push northward from that southern sort of Busan zone that basically caused the North Korean army to retreat in disarray. They were not prepared for this level of force coming from different directions. By the end of September, the ROK, Republic of Korea, South Korea, US and UN forces had driven the North Koreans back north of the 38th parallel. So they'd already retreated into the territory of the former sort of Soviet zone of control in north of the 38th parallel. The war could have ended at that point with a ceasefire along the 38th parallel, and that was surely proposed by North Korea and China. Let's just call it a day and redraw the line. But MacArthur would have none of such talk. And at the same time, with the Cold War going on, the strategy that some of the dominant voices in the United States had decided on with regard to communism was rollback. And that means not only confronting communist-held territories and communist countries, but actually trying to roll them back and roll back the communist advance all the way to the borders of Russia. That was their pipe dream because they didn't really understand the forces that drove people to embrace communism in the first place. Also in the midst of the anti-colonial spirit that was sweeping the world beginning in the 50s and 60s. And so MacArthur decided to be the poster child for rollback, and he was going to roll all the way back to the border of Korea, all the way back to the Yalu River on the border of Manchuria, which would now be part of China. And so the US and UN leaders paid no attention to Chinese threats to invade Korea if Western forces crossed the 38th parallel. They really didn't think China was up to an engagement with the level of force that they had at that time in Korea. Of course, the US and UN forces under MacArthur did just that. In early October of 1950, they crossed the 38th parallel and continued to push north. They took Pyongyang also in October, and then by November, the UN forces had advanced within sight of the Yalu River. They did not pay attention to the increasing numbers of Chinese regular troops crossing the river into North Korea. They believed this was just a kind of brinkmanship on behalf of Mao Zedong. But it turned out to be much more than that. By December 5th, the Chinese attacked and overwhelmed the US and UN lines that were poorly deployed at that point as they've been chasing retreating troops. Now they had to confront a coordinated attack coming at them. Also behind the North Koreans and the Chinese were Soviet anti-aircraft facilities and Soviet MiG fighters, MiG-15 fighters, that were piloted by Russians pretending to be Chinese and North Koreans. So the Soviet Union was in the thing to win it, let's just say. The Western troops retreated once again, found themselves on the defensive once again, and a large portion of US and UN troops actually found themselves cut off from retreat and completely surrounded near Wonsan. And they had to fight through several battalions of Chinese regulars to get to the sea and then be evacuated by ship out of North Korea. And so it was a devastating failure of US and UN forces. And once again, Seoul fell to now the Chinese on January 4th, 1951. So now we've rolled into the new year of 1951. After a series of military and political blunders, MacArthur was relieved of command April 11th, 1951. As we said, Seoul was retaken by the, now it's taken once again by the US and UN forces, liberated yet again on March 15th, 1951. And both sides began to seek a solution because obviously hundreds of thousands of soldiers are being lost, not to count the civilian casualties. As the Chinese had advanced, MacArthur ordered a carpet bombing campaign of North Korea. So the cities, almost every city, mid-level town was completely devastated, as well as small villages that were burned to the ground to prevent North Koreans from taking shelter in them. So, as well as Chinese troops. So, just North Korea was simply devastated by this conflict, and that would have repercussions until the present day in the relationships between the United States and North Korea. As the sides were seeking a stalemate, they did not stop fighting. And this is a horrible part of the war. From the spring of 1951 until July 27th, 1953, when when a ceasefire was finally declared along the 38th parallel once again. And so it's a conflict that cost so many lives, so much destruction, with no change in the status quo at the end of it. It's almost insulting that such a war could be fought. It's been estimated that as a result of the Korean War, there were 5 million Korean refugees from North and South Korea. There were huge redistributions and redisplacements of populations. Large numbers of just common people from North Korea ended up in the South seeking refuge from the conflict and were never able to go back. An estimated 10 million families were divided, separated by the conflict. Some entire states within the Korean Peninsula were simply cut in half by what became the DMZ, the dividing line, the demilitarized zone, the dividing line between North Korea and South Korea. And even until very recently, there were meetings of reunification meetings organized between the North and South to allow family members to still see and visit one another up until recently. The cities and towns and countryside of Korea were simply devastated, especially in the North. And that, as we mentioned, will have terrible consequences for the future of the country. I'm going to stop there. That gives you the overview of the Korean War. You'll notice that I have a series of maps, and you can put those alongside this video to kind of give you the flow of how the war went back and forth along the Korean Peninsula. And you can just imagine the destruction involved, the hatreds, the animosities that would have taken many generations to resolve and still are not resolved today in many ways. I hope you have a good week of study and continue working on your papers. And good luck with everything. And we'll see you next week in Korean history.